Second Bava Kamma is Daf Lamed, and I'll just give you an introduction for those who are nervous because they've been learning Daf for the last few weeks. It's a much easier than Daf than we've had in a long time. So don't be scared. We've had some really scary ones lately, but this one is not one of them, in my opinion. You might disagree, but we'll see. So today's we continue. Our parak is actually
there next Saturday night for Hanukkah.
I'm sorry?
Next Saturday night is Hanukkah. What time will you learn?
I think we should do this. I mean, we could maybe make it an hour afterwards if that's better, because you have to light. I think that's what I would propose, doing it. I don't think we have a lot of alternatives, but I would say maybe an hour after Shabbat, just to give extra time for those who are lighting and singing and eating a donut. But we'll put it in the Zoom, probably an hour afterwards. Again, tomorrow morning will be 7:45 a.m.
Is one donut the minimum shear?
It depends on the night of Hanukkah. One for the night. So anyways, let's learn today's daf. So this parak is discussing the next concept, which was bar. And bar, as we probably saw yesterday and many days before, is incredibly complex, right? Because on the surface, it seems somewhat simple. You dig a hole, an animal falls into it and dies, you're chayev, right? But we had a big machloket between Rav and Shmuel, huge machloket, as to why exactly you're chayev if someone's animal falls into your bar and dies. And one opinion was that because you caused the animal to die, right? It was your bar, it fell into it, you made the bar, you're guilty. But that seems pretty obvious. But Rav's opinion disagreed with that. And Rav said that, in fact, you're not chayev for a bar because it fell into it and died. Because the reality is that if an animal or a person, well, let's say a person, but an animal for sure, falls into a pit and hits the ground and dies, the thing that caused the damage is the ground, not the pit, right? And now I might have made the person fall into the pit by making a pit, but that's a grumma. That's only indirect damage. And you generally don't pay for indirect damage. So Rav came up with this concept a couple of days ago, that there's the hevel of the bar, that it's actually not the ground that kills the person or the animal, let's say, it's the air, right? The fumes or something about the bar. And that would have huge implications for things that are not below the ground, for a banana peel, for things like that, right? So Rav was of the opinion that if your banana peel causes someone to get hurt, you're only chayav not because it's a bar, but because it's a shar. It's essentially your animal, right? Your object. And if your object causes damage, you have to pay. But that's limited to certain cases. So says the Mishnah today, the second line of Daf Lamed, Hashofech mayim b'reshut harabim. Person decides to pour out their water. Usually it's dirty water, right? But doesn't matter right here. But you pour out your water into the street, right? You live in a house on top of the road, and you dump out your hot water after Shabbos, right? And huzak behen acher, someone gets damaged by this water, chayav b'nisko, you got to pay for the damage. Now, it's not clear right now whether this is because it's a bar, right? So you caused a hazard, or because it's a shar, meaning it's an attack and you hurt them. So we'll see. Meaning it's not clear if they fell by the water falling on them and they got hurt, or they got hurt because they slipped on the water and tripped, right? So we'll see that in the Gemara. Continues the Mishnah, Hamatznia et hakotz vet haschuchit, right? They had a big problem back in those days of recycling. Right, we are fortunate that we have hard containers. But back then, it was a little bit hard to get rid of your sharp items. Right? You had a lot of thorns, or you had a lot of broken glass, and you didn't know what to do with it. So what people used to do, I think, this is what our Mishnah makes it sound like, is they would put them into the walls. You would sort of, I guess, stick it into the wall so that no one would get damaged by your piece of glass or your thorn. Let's say you do that. Or goderet gidro bikotzim, or you make a fence that's actually a fence that is full of thorns. V'geder shenafal reshut harabim, or if you have a fence that actually falls into public, so the fence started off in your yard, but it fell into the public domain. V'huzak behen achirim, and someone got damaged by this thorn or this knife or this glass. Chayav b'niskan, you are chayav. Again, it seems a little repetitive, and the Gemara will discuss that. Says Rav about our Mishnah. Now, this water that caused damage, the point of the water is, Rama Rav, first line in the Gemara, Lo shanu el dinatfu kelav b'mayim. The case here is where you threw out dirty water, and the dirty water landed on somebody's beautiful new sweater, right, and ruined it. So, or on a person, or was scalding hot, or whatever it might be. But it directly caused damage, meaning it's a shore essentially. It's an ox, right? You cause damage. Avalhu atzmo patur. But if the person himself caused fell on it, meaning it fell on the ground, and the person slipped on it and ruined their what's it called? Ruined their sweater, then you'd be patur, because then it's a bar, and Rav, member, holds that a bar does not apply in this situation when it's not dug down, or it's not public, or it's not hefker, and karka olam hezikato, and therefore you view it as if the ground caused the damage. The person slipped on the water, fell on the ground, but the damage happened by the ground, not by the water. The water just caused him to hit the ground. And therefore it's a grumma, it's indirect damage, and you don't pay for indirect damage. I'm like, Rafuna the Rab, said Rafuna to Rab, 1 second. I don't understand. If you pour water out, right, and a person trips on it and falls into that water, sure, you could say it's the ground that caused the problem. But when water and ground mix together, it's mud, right? And if you throw your mud into Reshut Harabim and cause damage, you're chayav for someone getting hurt by that mud. So even if the water is indirect, it's your mud basically that caused damage. It should be like your refesh, and refesh is not necessarily mud; it's like a dung, right? But it's manure basically. You threw your mud into the Reshut Harabim, and so therefore, why is this person patur in this case? Answered Rav, misaver telotamu maya. You think the water is still there, meaning it's still mud when I poured it out? It's talking about a case bidutamu maya, where the water was finished, meaning the water absorbed into the ground. It's still on the surface, but it's not mud, right? It's dirt, and the person slipped on it and they fell. And in that case, says Rav, you're patur. So when our Mishnah says you're chayav for the water, it's talking about a case where the water itself caused damage because it was dirty and it landed on a sweater, or it was hot and it burned something. But that's the case where you're chayav, and that's Rav's opinion. As I told you, Shmuel disagrees with that opinion, but that's Rav's opinion, right? Because Rav really holds that your liquid in Reshut Harabim is not a bar. Okay? So that is the Rav's opinion. Ask the Gemara, well, we said that yesterday, if you remember, right? And the Gemara assumed that everyone goes to Daf Yomi every day, right? So ask the Gemara, why in the world, where am I? Tarti Lamali. Why the Mishnah on Chavchet Amen Aleph on the bottom, Rav said the exact same words, and he actually quoted our Mishnah, right? So there's a Mishnah Nishbra Kado. Anyways, Rav says the exact same words, word for word. So why do you need to have it twice? Why do you need to have it twice? Tarti Lamali says the Gemara, well, because you got to tell me Chada bimot hachama, v'chada bimot hageshamim. One is referring to the winter, and one is referring to the summer. Now, why would you need to tell me about winter and summer separately? Because the Tanya, as we pointed out in a Braita, it's the Tosefta, Kol elu sha'amru. There's many cases where we say that you can be potkin bibotehem. You're allowed to open up your storm pipes, your sewer pipes, really. It's not storm, right? Meaning people would gather together their stuff in their yard. You can sometimes, and that's going to be in the winter, you can open those up, right? You can open them up and let it go out into the public, into the street. You can release your trash. And garfin moroteim. And you can, cut out, garfin means to shovel out your dung heap, right? Your animal stuff, which is very smelly. I don't know if anyone's ever been on a farm, but I've been on a farm, but not ever actually stood in it. So those things you're allowed b'mota chama in the summertime. Ein lahem reshut. You don't have permission to redirect your garbage and your dung into the public street. But b'mota geshamim yesh lahem reshut. But in the winter, you're allowed to. So there's a special rule that during the winter season, partly because people need to do it, and partly because it's going to rain and it will wash it away, right? That you're allowed to put it out there. During the summer, you put your junk in the public, it'll stay there, it'll sit there, right? So they didn't allow you to do it in the summer, but they allowed you to do it in the winter. So therefore, you might have thought, wait a second, if you're allowed to put your dirty water in the public in the winter, maybe you're not chayav if your dirty water happened to hit somebody and ruin their sweater, right? Because you're allowed to do it. So you might have thought, if Rav had told you this only once, you would have thought Rav said you can't do it in the summer. But in the winter, you're allowed to do it. And that's why we said it twice to tell you can't do it in either time. And says the Gemara, why is that? Because Alpha P, Shebereshut, even though you're allowed to put it out there into the street, it doesn't mean you can shoot it at other people, right? Im hiziko chayivin l'shalim. When we say you're allowed to put it out, doesn't mean we said you could put it out and you're absolved of anything it causes. If you put it out, then it causes damage. You got to pay that damage. Continue the Mishnah. Hamatzniya takot, if you hide your thorns in the wall and someone gets damaged by it, they're chayiv. Amar Reb Yochanan, lo shanu ela mafriach. That's only if your thorns are sticking out of the wall, right? Meaning you put them in a way, or it turned out to be a way where they are protruding. Aval mitzamtzein, if they're not protruding, they're in the wall, and the person only got hurt because they scraped up against the wall or they reached into it, right? Reached into the bush. Then you're patur. Take out the next two words. Then you're patur. The reason is that it's not normal for people to scrape up against walls, right? Because people know the wall might have rough surfaces, it might have things that will cut me. And so therefore, as long as people are not expected to do this thing, you're not chayav for them doing something unusual and getting damaged on your watch, right? So the rule is you only have to anticipate things if they're common, not if they're uncommon. Tanur Rabbanan, says the Braita, right? Let's say a person's got a lot of thorns and a lot of glass to get rid of, and they don't have anything to do with it. So they come up with a brilliant idea. I will put it in the wall that my friend is building down the block, right? So I don't have any room in my house, or I don't want to put it in my yard and my kids trip on it. I'll put it in somebody else's wall. So you put your thorns into somebody else's fence. And then, uba bal kotel, v'satar kotlo. Then the guy who built the fence, who doesn't necessarily know that you did this, he comes and he says, I don't really want this fence anymore. And he cuts it down. And it falls into the public, viziko. And now your thorns in his wall cause damage. So he had nothing to do with the thorns, right? But you put them in someone else's wall, and he cut down the wall, which is all legitimate. Says the Braita, chayav hamatzniya. The person who hid them in the wall is the one who has to pay for the damage, because he's the one who caused the damage, right? He took his thorns, he put them in a place where they're going to cause damage, and so he's got to pay for any damage that they cause. That's the Braita. Says Reb Yochanan, that's only true. Lo shano b'koto re'ua. That's only if you put them into a wall that was, it's a rickety wall. It was on its way down. It was going to fall, right? And therefore, he should have anticipated, look, this wall is not that sturdy. It might fall down. And therefore, if it falls down and it causes damage, I'm responsible. Ava bikoto bari, but if the wall is healthy, right, meaning it's a strong wall, and then later it falls down, or later the person who owns the wall knocks it down on purpose, then hamatzniya patur, the one who hid it there is patur, because he could say, I put it in a secure place. I had no expectation the wall was going to fall down. And so I'm not guilty for that, right? It's like if I watch my dog or my cow, my shar, and someone else releases it. I watched it properly, right? But the balakotel, chayiv balakotel, the one whose wall it was and knocked it down has to pay, because his wall had thorns in it. He should have looked for them. He should have thought about that. And therefore he has to pay. Amar Ravina, says Ravina, this tells us a very important halacha. Right? Let's say a person has a bar. A bar is a water, right? A pit, a well, right? Like in the parshiot. You got a bar, and the bar, of course, is very dangerous, right? People can fall into it, animals can fall into it, but it's covered by a bucket, right? There's a bucket that fits perfectly into the well, but it's not your bucket, right? Someone else put their bucket on the top of your bar to completely cover it. Uba bal deli, and then the owner of the bucket comes, v'natal delyo, and he takes away his bucket. So now your bar is open. But when you went away for work this morning, your bar was closed. Someone else came along who owns, now, obviously, if you covered your bar with your own thing and someone took off your cover, they're responsible, right? Because they took away your cover and they made it into a bar. But here are the cases where you use somebody else's bucket, or it was happened to be there, and that person came and walked away with their bucket, right? So we are making the analogy to now the one who took away the bucket is like the one who has the wall, right? And the one who dug the bar is like the one who put the thorns into the wall, right? So that the original person would be chayav. So says Ravina, if you do this, so you have a well, you have a bucket inside of it, and the owner of the bucket takes that away, and then someone gets damaged in the bar, chayav bal habar. The owner of the bar is chayav, and that's exactly what we just said. Sigmar pshita, which seems pretty obvious. It's the exact same case as the wall and the thorns. Mao detema, I would have thought, hatamhu delo havi yadale delo de. By the wall, right? The person who had a wall with thorns in it could not have talked to anyone and informed them about the need to take the thorns out of the wall. They didn't know who put them in there, right? They didn't know who it was. You might have thought that here, because this person knows who owns the bucket, right? You know whose it is. You should have informed that person. Oh, by the way, I'm taking away my bucket, or you have your bucket there. This is protecting the bar. Kamashma, that you don't have that responsibility, so that it's normal and it's expected that if something is there that's not yours, that it might be removed. And if you have to anticipate that damage, and you're chayiv if your bar causes damage. Tanu Rabbanan, now says the Gemara on this topic of sort of getting rid of hazards, right? Getting rid of nuclear waste. Chasidim Arishonim, the early people who were very meticulous about not causing damage to other people. They had waste that was sharps, as James pointed out before. They would hide the sharps bitoch sadoteim, in their own fields. They would not put it out in the public, right, in somebody else's field. They would put it in their own field, but they would dig it deep, so deep that it would never come up. And that is mamikim lahem shloshat tfachim. They would put it down 3 tfachim, which is not nothing, right? It's a foot down almost. And obviously in a rocky field, that's very hard to do. And they would do that kadesh lo ya'akev ha'machresha, so that the plow wouldn't pull it up, right? The plows went down 3 tfachim, which again, we say a tefach's around 3 or 4 inches, so almost a foot. And so if you put it too shallow, then you'll forget about it. 2 years from now, 5 years from now, someone's going to be plowing the field, and they're going to come up with a lot of sharps, right? Which I think probably still will happen in some places, right? Or nuclear waste. So these people were very careful to dig down and put it really, really far down. Rav Sheshet Shadilu Benura. Rav Sheshet went one step further. He would burn his stuff. So he would light a fire and burn all the sharps in the fire. I don't think they do that in the hospital directly, but I guess ultimately that's probably what they do, right? They incinerate them. Rava Shadile B'diglat. Rava had another.
It's an autoclave.
Right, so they burn it. Exactly, that's what he did. Rava had a better solution, which is probably what they do at NYU. He threw it in the East River. Shadile B'diglat. He would throw it into the Diglat, which is the Tigris River. The Chideka is the Hebrew. So he would throw it into the water. I'm not sure. The fish might not have been so happy about that, but I guess that was before they realized such a thing. Rav Yehuda, now says Rav Yehuda, think about this Gemara, right? It's not so simple to be a righteous person. If you want to be, a real righteous person, you've got to think about the impact of all your actions on other people, right? Think about this. You've got all your waste. It's not enough to just throw it away. You got to think about what's going to happen. Rava says, you should think about mili da avot. You should be really careful about the things in avot. Most understand that avot here means mesechet avot. Of course, the other explanation might be the avot of our parsha, right? Our forefathers reading these parshiot. So you should be careful about those things. And Amrila, some said milig de brachot. Some say it's the things that have to do with mesechet brachot. You should be very careful in making brachot. And that's sort of the traits of a righteous, or chassid, not a righteous person, but I translate chassid in English, a chassid. Some person. So that is the end of that Gemara. Continues the Mishnah, similar concept to what we had before. It was a very common thing back in those times, right? You needed to have a compost heap, right? So it was very hard. I guess you probably had very little space, but you had at the end of the season, you had a lot of teven and kash, right? A lot of grain, and kash is straw, right? The remains basically of your wheat, of your grain, and you want to turn that into compost, right? Into zevel, which is a manure, right? Not manure, but compost. So what they used to do is you could let it sit, I guess, and rot, but a more efficient thing is you would put it out in the street and people would walk on it, right? And animals would go to the bathroom on it. And I don't know, all kinds of stuff would happen, and it would whatever happens to manure, right? It would, or to compost. It would start having organic processes happening inside it, right? So people used to do that. Now, of course, the people who had to walk down the street were not very happy about this because the street is public, right? It's like putting on the Henry Hudson Parkway. You stick out all your hay, right? Would not go over very well. So that's what a person did. Said the Mishnah, Hamotzia tivno v'kasho l'reshut rabim nizvalim. Person puts out their hay and their kash and their grain into the public road to turn into manure, to turn into compost. V'huzak b'hem acher, and someone gets damaged. They walk into it, they fall over it, they get scratched by it. Chayav b'nisko. You are chayav to pay their damage. The person who put it out there is chayav to pay their damage. And furthermore, kol hakodem b'hem zacha. Anyone who takes it is free to take it, meaning you put it out in the public, you might have thought you're going to come back and get it in a month, but it's the middle of the street. Anyone who sees that can show up and pick it up and take your hay if they want it for their own compost or for their own animals or whatever it might be. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel said in the Mishnah, Kol mekalkalin b'reshut rabim, anything that causes damage, meaning anything that's an obstacle that you put in the reshut rabim, and then his zikan, and they cause damage, chayavin l'shalim, you got to pay. Now it sounds exactly like what the Tana Kamma said, right? And continues Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, v'chol hakodem b'hem, anyone who comes to get it, zacha, gets it. Now, again, it sounds exactly like the Tana Kamma. The Gemara is going to ask what Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is arguing about or what he's adding. How fech et hagalal b'reshut rabim, if you put your galal, right, into reshut rabim, galal is manure, right? So it is ready-made compost, as we might say, but you take a big scoop of your cow turds and you put them out in a pile in Reshut Rabim, then if someone gets damaged, you are chayav to pay the nezek. Interestingly, and the Gemara is going to be medayek, it doesn't say that anyone who wants can come and take it, right? So we'll see why that might be in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, well, this Mishnah, lema matnitin delok Rabbi Yehuda. This seems not to go according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya, because there's a very important breita of Rabbi Yehuda, which we've actually had before, it's a Tosefta in Bava Metzia, that Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Bishat Hotzaad Zvalim. In the season where people put their zevel, right, their garbage, their excrement, right? It's not excrement, it's leftover grain. Right. So in the season of taking out your grain, which I guess would be the fall, right? After you've harvested and you've bundled it together and it's all been turned into, you took out all the useful stuff. So there's, tons and tons and tons of leaves, as they put it, right? So you got all this extra stuff. So during that season, Adam motzi zivlul reshut rabim, you're allowed to put it, you can put your leaves, let's say, obviously it's not leaves, it's teven, but you can throw your leaves out into the middle of the street. Everyone's allowed to do that. There's a specific time. It's called, say, October, right? V'tzovro kol shloshim yom, and people will walk on it for all 30 days, right? Kedei shehei nishuf. V'tzovro, you can leave it out there. Kol shloshim yom. Kedei shehei nishuf raglei adam u'raglei behema, so that it will get stomped on and trampled and processed by the feet of people and animals that are walking down the street. And shalminat kain hinchil Yoshua ta'aretz. When Yoshua made Eretz Yisrael, now, this is a terminology we use, it's not necessarily literal. We're going to have a Gemara later that talks about many rules that they sort of made when they were settling the land. But one of the rules was that, you're allowed to use the public space during this month of the year when everybody's got their grain in order for people to walk on it so that it becomes processed, and you could then use it for compost, right? So therefore, people are allowed to do that. Now, if you're allowed to do that, how could you be chayav if someone gets damaged? Says where those things are not contradictory. I feel Rabbi Yehuda. Mod Rabbi Yehuda shemizik mishalim mashizik. Right? You're allowed to do it, meaning you're allowed to use the public. But if someone gets damaged, so just putting it out in public doesn't mean someone's going to get damaged, right? It's going to inconvenience people. But what Mishnah is saying is that if someone gets hurt, you got to pay, and that's not a chiddush, right? That's not a contradiction. Sorry, it is a chiddush, but it's not a contradiction. It's not just, but that's not true. Look at the following. It should say Atanya, right? Look at the following breita. Atanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda said, "B'ner Chanukah patur." Remember, we had last week that if you have a light and an animal, a camel's walking down with straw, and it lights on fire, If your fire's outside your store, you're chayav in general, because you're not supposed to have a fire out in public, right? But if it's Ner Chanukah coming up next week, right, then it's mutar because you're allowed to put Ner Chanukah out there. So there you're patur, mipnei shu b'reshut. So because it was done with permission. So if you're allowed to do something, then you should be patur for any damage that it causes. So if Yoshua made a condition that you're allowed to put your excess waste in public, then why are you chayav if someone gets hurt for it? Says Gemara, lai lav mishum reshut beitin, because there's permission. Lo mishum reshut mitzvah. Ner Chanukah is different because it's a mitzvah. It's one thing if you're doing a mitzvah, you'll be patur, but just because you're allowed to put your garbage in the street doesn't mean that you're patur if someone gets hurt from your garbage. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'ner Chanukah patur b'nei reshut mitzvah. The reason you're patur in Ner Chanukah is not because you have permission only, but because it's permission specifically to do a mitzvah. Tashma. Says the Braita, and this is very clear, Kol elu shamrim mutarim lekalkel.
How are those two answers different? I'm sorry.
Sorry?
How are those two lines?
We're confirmed. So our assumption was that if Rabbi Yehuda says that you're allowed to put your junk in the street, it means that if it then hurts someone, you're not reliable. And we answered, no, you're allowed to put your junk in the street, but you're guilty. You have to pay if someone gets hurt. Ask the Gemara, what about by Ner Chanukah, where Rabbi Yehuda said, since you're allowed to light Ner Chanukah in the street, if it lights someone on fire, you're not chayav. The Gemara answered, well, it's specifically Ner Chanukah, not because you had permission to do it, but because it's a mitzvah, that therefore you're patur. And then we quoted a Braita which said that explicitly, that the reason you're
so
Ner Chanukah,
Rabbi Yehuda is just quoting the Braita again to
correct.
us.
Well, we didn't have these words in the Braita before. Yeah, but this Braita said, Mishut reshut mitzvah. The Mishnah we had last week said Neshu Reshut, period.
No, but then he says Amar b'ner Chanukah patur mipnei shehu reshut mitzvah.
Correct. So that's the Braita. The Mishnah said just the word Reshut. We're explaining it's not any Reshut, it's not any permission, it's only permission for a mitzvah. And then we find a Braita which says that explicitly.
Gotcha.
Tashma.
Thank you.
Says Gemara, no problem. 3 lines from the bottom. Kol elu shamru mutarim lekalkel b'reshut harabim. Whenever we say you're allowed to put your junk, right, in Reshut Harabim, you're allowed to put your storm drain, you're allowed to release your septic tank, you're allowed to do at certain seasons. You're allowed to put your manure sometimes. You're allowed to put your straw. All of those things, im hiziko chayavin l'shalem. You got to pay if it causes damage, which is what our Mishnah said. And Rabbi Yehuda poter. Rabbi Yehuda says you're poter. Now, so clearly Rabbi Yehuda can't go according to our Mishnah. He says very explicitly that if you're allowed to put your thing in Reshut Harabim, you're poter. Amr of Nachman, no. It could be that that's true that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, but not that he disagrees with our Mishnah. Because our Mishnah might be Shalom B'Shat Hotzat Zvalim, that there's a season, right? There's a time of year, a month of year, or whatever it might be, where you're allowed to put out your leaves. And if you put out your leaves during that time, Rabbi Yehuda says you're poter if it causes damage, because everybody knows about this. But if you put out your leaves a different time of the year, which is what our Mishnah would be referring to, then you're chayav, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. So he doesn't necessarily disagree with our Mishnah. Rav Ashi Amar, Rav Ashi says, no. It's different. Because tivno v'kashotznan mishum de misharki. Our Mishnah was not specifically talking about putting out necessarily your manure or your compost or your water. It was specifically referring to teven, right? Grain, and not a grain like the stalks, because those are very slippery. And the point was that if you're putting something slippery out, then you are definitely chayav, even if you have permission to put things out, because you can't put something out that's hazardous. Just saying you could put out the garbage doesn't mean you could put out, broken glass in your garbage. So therefore, our Mishnah is specifically because it's something that's a high risk of damage. Now, continued our Mishnah, top line now of Daf Lamed Amud Bet. Our Mishnah said, Kol hakodem bahem zacha. Anyone who picks up this straw that you put out in public is allowed to keep it. Amar Rav. Now, Rav said a very interesting halacha. You put out the straw into public because you want people to step on it and turn it into compost, right? Says Rav, not only are you allowed to keep the compost that was made in public, you can actually take the straw before it became compost. Says Rav, bein begufan, you're allowed to keep either the object, meaning the straw itself, or bein b'shvachan, or the product it's turned into, which is the goal, right, which is the compost. So whether you're allowed to take either one, and why, and Zeiri says, the third line, b'shvachan, no. If someone puts their straw into public and people walk on it and it turns into compost, you're allowed to take the compost. Avalo begufam, but you can't take their straw. They're allowed to put their straw out there and you're not allowed to take it. But what's the argument? Rav Savar, look, it's a knas, right? We're fining the person for using the public for his own personal needs. And says Rav, kansu gufan mishum shvachan. Since we're going to let you keep the value added, meaning the compost, we also put a knas on the actual thing itself, and you can take the straw. And Ziri says, no. We only made a knas on the compost, but not on the original straw. Lo kansu gufan mishum shvachan. So it's not. Now let's try to prove from the following Mishnah what is correct, right? So the Mishnah says, and this was the end of our Mishnah, hahofech et hagalal b'reshut harabim. Person puts their galal, puts their refuse into reshut harabim, v'huzak behem acher, and someone gets damaged by it, they slip on it or hurts them or dirties their clothing, chayav b'nisko. You're chayav to pay the damage. Now, as I pointed out when we read the Mishnah, it doesn't say the next few words. It doesn't say, and anyone can keep it, right? Now think about it. Manure has no value added, right? Straw that you put out in public, as people trample it, it breaks down and it becomes compost. So it's much better for a field. But manure is already good for the field. So when you put it out there, nothing will be added to it by being out there. You might get less of a smell in your house, but it doesn't become more valuable because people walk on it or animals walk on it, right? So therefore, potentially, right? So it doesn't say that anyone can get it. So this seems to imply that Rav is wrong. Rav said you get to keep the principle as well as the value. Here it seems to say that you only get to keep the value, and that's why we only said it by the straw, and we didn't say you get to keep the act. You can't take the thing when it comes to dung, to the actual manure of the animal. This is where that's not a proof, because Tana the ratio, we said it in the beginning, and we mean you're smart enough to realize the same clause is true in the Seifa. Who had in the Seifa? Says where that's not correct. Taniela, there's a Breita that says Asurin Mishum Gezel, that it's Gezel, it's stealing if someone takes it. So it can't be that you're allowed to take it, which is Rav's opinion. Says the Gemara, no. Kika Tani Asurin Mishum Gezel, that is a kula matnitin koi, right? It's referring to everything in the Mishnah, and it's referring to Odo Shekadam Vizacha. It's saying that if someone comes and says, I acquire this, and then someone else wants to take it from him, it would be Geza. Meaning it's a way of saying that the first person who gets it's like Hefker, right? The first person who gets it from Hefker, they're the new owner. And if anyone wants to take it away from them, then it's Geza. It says, you know, what you're saying, it makes a little bit of sense, but there's an explicit Breita which disagrees with you. The Gersa should be Titania, or like 10 lines from the top, right? It says Ditznan, but it should say Titania. Says the Breita and the Tosefta, Hat Motzi Tivno v'kasho l'reshut harabim l'zvalim. A person specifically takes his grain, his straw, he puts it out into public to turn into compost. V'huzak b'hem acher chayav v'nisko. If someone gets damaged by it, then you have to pay the damage. V'kol hakodem b'hem zachan. Anyone who comes to take it is allowed to take it. Umudar mishum gezel. It's not a problem of stealing. And so that's the first case, the case of straw. And continues the Breita, if you put your manure into reshut harabim, v'zak b'hem acher chayav, and someone gets damaged, they're chayav, v'asr mishum gezel, but no one's allowed to take it. So this explicitly goes against Rav. Rav said you're allowed to keep the principle, meaning the object put into reshut harabim, and what it turned into. And this Breita seems to differentiate between straw, which turns into compost, and manure, which doesn't turn into anything, and says one you're allowed to take and one you're not allowed to take.
But it's Hefker.
So no, so the point is that it's not Hefker, that you put it out there and you're putting it out there on the assumption that you're going to take it back in, right? So you did not mafker it. You put it in a place where it's not, you don't own it, right? So you can't be shocked if someone steals it. It's not protected. But your intention is to take it back. You just don't have room, or you don't have the space or something, right? And just to be clear, with the straw, what you would hope for is you put it out in the street. You want all the animals to walk over it so that 3 weeks later, it's broken down and you can take it back in and use it as compost. So you did not intentionally mafker it. What we're saying is that you are not allowed to use the public that way, and so we would fine you. But according to Zeiri, which is what the Breita seems to be going according to, we only fine you for the value added, for the thing that it became. We don't fine you for the original, right? Says the Gemara, says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Galal Karamit. You're asking a question from manure? Davar sheyesh bo shevach kansu gufo mishum shvacho. When you're talking about straw or hay or things like that, which can get better in value by being walked on, then we made a knas. We find you. Why'd you put that out in the public? You got to pay. But davar she'ein bo shevach lo kanso. But if it's things like manure, which we did not, that cannot go up in value by putting it out there, so you have very little to gain by putting it out in public. There, we didn't put a knas on you. So that's the difference, even according to Rav. Ibaylu. Now that's the Gemara. Interesting question. If you care about this case, the Divrei Omer Kanso Gufan Mishum Shvachan. When we say what Rav says, right, that we put a knas on the object of the straw because you put it out there in order for it to go up in value. But is the knas when it goes up in value, that after it's already increased, then you can take back, someone else can take the straw and the compost, right? Is it la'alter kansinan? Do we find you right away? Or the knas only applies when you left it out there long enough for it to go up in value. Says Mar Tashma, let's bring a proof. Midaka iron galal. You asked a question from manure. Now, manure never goes up in value. So the fact, it seems that Rav would hold his case even by manure. Well, Tizbra, is that really true? Ki Irinam, when we asked a question from the manure, galal, mikami delishni Rav Nachman. That was before we had the answer of Rav Nachman, who pointed out that Rav only made his fine about things that will go up in value, which is like straw. But Rav would not make his fine about things like manure. But there, Deshani Rav Nachman, galal klal. Once Rav Nachman gave that answer, the galal is not related in any way. There's no halacha of fines when you talk about manure. So if you put your manure out in public, according to everybody, no one can take it. If someone falls on it, then you have to pay, right? You have to pay the damage, but no one is allowed to keep your manure. It's wrong. They could steal it, obviously, but that's wrong. It's gezo, but they can't take it legally. If you put out your hay or things like that, then it's a machloka between Rav Nachman and Rav about whether someone can take it, the actual thing. Lema Kitanai. This is where, let's, in our last few minutes today, our last 4 minutes.
So you can use a public reshoot as your own storage?
So you're not allowed to, but someone did anyway. So what are we going to do to you? Right?
So there's no kanas.
There's no specific kanas, correct. But you might get a fine from the government, but not kanas from the Gemara.
But didn't do the same thing actually when it was like the season to harvest the olives and make oil, and they left everything outside?
Correct. So
Yeah.
there's different cases, right? So some are where they specifically allowed you during the certain seasons, like you said, to put your stuff out there, and that's a question about during those times are you chayev, right? That was the machloka we had in Amud Aleph. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not chayev. According to others, you are chayev, right? This is talking about other times potentially. So you're not necessarily allowed to do it. But so the question is, what are you responsible for, right? So the answer is that, like bar, if you put something slippery in the public domain and someone falls on it, you're going to have to pay, right? But that doesn't mean that they can take it and keep it. It's still yours, right? So it doesn't mean that they can necessarily take it, and that's a knas specifically for putting something out there.
Okay.
It says where let's say this seems like the following machloket tanaim, and this is an interesting application of this, which gets off of Bava Kamma straight to Bava Metzia. Shtar shekotuv bo ribit. I lend someone, I won't say me, say Reuven lends money to Shimon. I lend him $100, and they write in the document, I'm lending Shimon $100. He's going to pay me back $150, which is interest, right? And totally prohibited according to the Torah. So says the Breita, Konsinoto, we find Reuven, who wrote this in the shtar, the Eno Goven, he cannot use the shtar to collect, lo at a Karen, velo at a ribit, Rabbi Meir. You can't collect the extra, which is obvious, but you can't even collect the Karen from the shtar because the shtar is thrown out, basically, right? So but it's a fine. Essentially, we punish you because you wrote the extra, which is prohibited. We don't even let you use the shtar for the principal. And the Chachamim omrim, no, go v'ta Karen. Yeah, obviously you can collect. This is an admission that I borrowed $100,000 or $100. And so you can use it to prove that. And remember with the shtar, you can use it to collect things if he sold afterwards, right? Avalo at the ribit. But obviously you can't collect the interest because interest is prohibited. So Lema Rav Damak Rabbi Meir, Rav who finds you for the principle because of what the extra is like Rabbi Meir, and Ziri Damak Rabbanan. Now, of course, that's not good for Rav because Rav does not want to be like a Dat Yachid, like Rabbi Meir. So Amar Lecha Rav would say to you, no. Another Amir feel the Rabbanan. I agree with the Rabbanan there that the shtar is still good for the principle, and we only fine you for the rebit. Because Rabbanan said that you're allowed to use the shtar to collect from the Karen to behetira, because obviously you are perfectly within your rights to write a shtar and collect a Karen. Avohacha Karen gufa kamazik. Here, it's the straw itself which is causing the damage, right? So there's something wrong with you even starting the process here. You're not supposed to, like we've all said, you're not supposed to put your junk out in public. And Ziri would say to you, Amar Lecha, the first wide line, another Amir Fil Rabbi Meir. I could even agree with Rabbi Meir about interest, because Adkan look Amir Rabbi Meir Hatam by interest that we find you El Demishat Ktiva at the time that you actually wrote the thing, right? The case here is avad. You did avad leishuma. You did something which established it as something wrong because you wrote $100 and he's going to pay me back $150. Avahacha miyemer demazik. Here, it's not guaranteed that there's going to be damage, right? You did something that you're not supposed to do, but it doesn't mean someone's going to fall and get hurt on it. And so there, you absolutely did something wrong. Here, it's not so clear, and so therefore they're not exactly the same case. Says, okay. What about the following Braita, which is back to Bava Kamma? Lema kahani tonight. What about the following Braita, third wide line? Hamotzi tivno v'kashod reshut rabim lizvalim. You put your straw, your I don't know a different word for it, but teven, your kash, into the public street in order for it to turn into compost, right? You want people and animals to walk on it and to turn it into something softer and usable, into dirt, basically, but organic dirt. Right? So v'huzak behem acher, and someone gets damaged by this, chayev benisko. Okay, you got to pay their damage. We said this in the Mishnah. This is well known to us. Continues the Braita, v'chola kodem behem zacha. Anyone who wants to take this home with him can take it home with him. V'asurin mishum gezel. Now we understood that earlier to mean that someone who wants to take it from that person would be usher, but the Gemara is going to ask that again in a second, right? Because it seems to contradict itself. It says you're allowed to take them, but it's stealing. Right? So it can't both be true. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, and this is again a paraphrase of our Mishnah, where Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel added something. Anyone who puts damaging things into public, and they cause damage, you have to pay the damage. And anyone who wants can take it. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says something different than the Tanna Kamma. Here he says, and it's not stealing. So first says the Gemara, 1 second. Agufakash. It doesn't make any sense what you just said. Because Amrit, you said in the Tanna Kamma, anyone who gets it gets to keep it. And then you said you're not allowed to, it's stealing. So are you allowed to take it or not allowed to take it? What we are probably arguing about is not the added value, the compost. It's the principle, right? And what the Braita is saying, that's bishvacham. If it became more valuable, anyone can take that because you use the public basically to turn your thing into something more valuable. But asurin mishum gezel agufan. But you can't take the straw. That's the Tanna Kamma. And then Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel comes to say, which is not like Rav, remember, right? That's the Iri. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel lemeimar filu gufan nami kol kodem zacha, right? So this seems to say that there's a machloket tanaim about whether you can take the principle. And according to the Tanna Kamma, you're not allowed to. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, you are allowed to. And of course, Rav doesn't love this because the Tanna Kamma seems to be the majority, right? It's the Stam Mishnah. So it says where Ziri vade Tanai. Ziri would definitely agree with you that it's a machloket tanaim, and that's what they're arguing about in our Mishnah. But the Rav, mi lemaket tanai, Rav would say, no, that's not what they're saying. The Kuli Alma, everybody agrees that Kansu Gufa Mishum Shvacham. There's a fine that people are allowed to take the principle. If you throw your hay into the street, everyone who, in order for it to become compost, you want to keep it, it doesn't matter. We fine you and we allow people to take it. So why does it say, and it's Mishum Gezel? Because although it's the halacha, we don't tell people that. We are halacha, the ein morin kain kamiflagi. It's a halacha, but we don't tell people this. So we don't inform the public that you're allowed to take it because we don't want everyone to go around taking things. So we say it's gezel, even though it's not gezel. The halacha is you're allowed to take it, but we tell people not to take it, or we don't tell them that you're allowed to take it. And that's the Tana Kamma. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, no way, just tell everyone they can take it. The Itmar, in fact, Rav Huna Amarav said, halacha, that you're allowed to take the keren, ve'in marin came, but we don't tell people the halacha, because we don't want people to go around taking it so easily. So they are allowed to, and if they do out of anger or out of whatever, then we don't make them pay it back, but we don't tell them to go ahead and take it. Rav actually said, I don't agree with that. I went further, and Amar, he said, halacha, marin came. Halacha is like Rav, that you can take it, and we tell people to take it. If you want to throw your tevin into Reshut Rabim, I'm going to tell people to take it from you. Aini says, is that true? Rav Huna afker chushli. Rav Huna, when someone put chushli into the public, and Rashi says chushli is barley, right? That was moist, and people would put it out so that it would dry up, right? If they didn't have space in their house, right? So Rav Huna actually would get up and say, you know what? Joe threw out chushli. Anyone who wants can go take it. It's hefker. And Rav Adar Ava afger slikusuta. Rav Adar Ava would say that anyone could take slikuta. Now slikusa, Rashi says, is either when they made the dates. They would press their dates and make them into wine and beer and things like that. The extra dates that they had, they would put out to dry. Here's another explanation too. But anyways, they would put this out to dry. So Bishlam Rav Adar Ava, what's the top line of Laman Aleph and Aleph? Kishmate, that's what he said. Halacha umarim came, that you allow people to take this and you tell them that they're allowed to take it. But Ela Rav Huna, what Rav Huna said that's halacha, but it's not. You don't tell people. So how could Rav Huna said it's hefker, right? Lema Hadarbe, did he change his mind? Answers the Gemara, no. Hanu mutarim havi. This is an important answer. These people were warned several times. It wasn't their first time doing it, right? So if you break the law the first time, we don't necessarily tell people that you broke the law and they can take your thing. But if you keep doing this every week or every year and you make it a regular practice, then we punish you and we tell people to take it. So you see that there's nuance here, right? That in fact, if I take my thing and put it into Reshut Rabim, it's not free. If I say it's not hefker, I want to get it back. I just want it to dry out there. People are not really supposed to take it, right? Supposed to. But in fact, there's a knas, and we fine you according to Rav, and that's how we paskin, that we let people take it, but we don't tell them about it, right? We don't announce that. But if you're doing it many times, then for sure we allow people to take it. And so obviously this is something done based on the need of the time and the damage it was causing to other people. And so that would be customized.
Who gets fined?
The person who owns it. So meaning the owner of all this, it could be $10,000 of dried figs, right? You put out there and the person wants them to get dried out. We announce anyone who wants can come and take it according to that opinion, or we don't announce it, but the halacha is that if people come and take it, they're allowed to keep it. So that's the fine. The fine is that you could lose your object. Tomorrow's daf, it will start from the Mishnah, Lamed Aleph. It's a short daf if you look at the words. If you look at Tosfot on Lamed Aleph and Rashi and Amud Beis, you will see that this is one of the most complicated lines we're going to have. So come with a lot of coffee, I would say. But we will be learning tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. Because I'm not available in the evening, and pick it up from there. God willing, finish tomorrow's daf. So Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov.
Ellie, is that your brother's in town?
My brother's in town with a baby, new baby.
Mazel tov.
Mazel Tov.
Thank you all. Shavua
So
Tov.
wait.
How long will they be here?
Not to be determined, to be honest with you, till the baby's old enough to fly back to Israel, I think.
So is Nava in?
Nava's coming on Wednesday,
Okay.
God willing. So next Shabbat we'll have Nava.
Okay.
Nice.
Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you.